45,000 years ago, modern humans entered Europe for the first time. They were not walking into a land of opportunity, but into a continent of nightmares. Ice sheets clawed across the horizon. Beasts larger and more ruthless than anything alive today roamed freely. And in the caves and forests waited a rival humanity, Neanderthals, stockier, stronger, and far more adapted to the brutal cold. For a moment in time, the fate of our species hung by a thread. Would we thrive or would we vanish? Just another failed experiment swallowed by the unforgiving Ice Age. 45,000 years ago, the first modern humans stepped into Europe, a land that was not a welcoming cradle of civilization, but a frozen arena of survival, where every breath was stolen from cold air and every shadow might conceal death. And as they moved cautiously across plains crusted with ice, they entered a world already claimed by others, creatures of terrifying strength and cunning, and Neanderthals, a rival humanity who had mastered these harsh conditions long before us. The forests stretched dark and endless, filled with sounds unlike anything our species had known in Africa. The crack of branches beneath the weight of towering mammoths, the growl of cave lions whose paws pressed silently into snow, the bone-chilling howls of wolves larger and more coordinated than those alive today. And above it all, the biting wind that carved faces raw and left hands numb until they barely felt alive. For these small bands of humans, survival was not a story of destiny, but of fragile advantage. Each tool and each decision balanced against a world that did not care whether they thrived or perished. They carried blades flaked from stone so sharp they could slice flesh with surgical precision, bone needles to thread hides into clothing that clung to their bodies like a second skin. And fire, that most fragile ally, flickering within caves and beneath rocky shelters, its warmth a shield against the darkness, and yet always at risk of being snuffed out by the raging storms. Their bodies were leaner than the Neanderthals who watched them from the forests, and though they lacked the sheer brute strength of these older cousins, they carried something more subtle, an ability to weave ideas together, to turn memory into strategy, and to shape survival not through muscle, but through imagination. Though in those early days, that imagination was tested almost to breaking. Food was never secure. A mammoth could feed a band for weeks, but bringing one down was a gamble that could end in broken bones and blood soaking into snow, while reindeer, bison, and wild horses moved in great migrations across the steppe, forcing our ancestors to chase them with persistence and patience, sometimes tracking them for days, pushing their bodies beyond exhaustion, relying on endurance rather than speed to collapse prey that was far stronger than themselves. Nights were longer than anything they had known, the darkness absolute, pressing down on them with silence broken only by distant growls, and every spark of fire became not just light but life, the thin barrier between safety and the unseen eyes watching from the edges of the glow. Neanderthals lived here already, their presence heavy in the land, their footprints pressed into snow beside our own, their tools scattered in caves, their bodies hardened by generations of cold. To meet them was to meet a mirror both familiar and alien, a rival with fire in their eyes, capable of tenderness yet also of fierce defense. And for a time the two species coexisted, sometimes sharing knowledge, sometimes sharing blood, and other times locked in competition over game and shelter. The outcome uncertain, the balance precarious. Disease lurked in the damp air of caves, hunger carved away at flesh during lean winters, and every decision to move, to hunt, to risk could tilt the fragile thread of existence towards survival or extinction. Yet even in this terrifying crucible, something remarkable stirred. For these humans carried not only tools but stories, whispered by firelight, stories that bound them together, that taught children the dangers of the hunt, that imagined spirits in the beasts they pursued, and that gave them a sense of belonging larger than the moment. And it was perhaps this ability to dream, to plan, to connect, that allowed them to endure where so many others faltered. But the truth is that nothing was guaranteed. In those first centuries, the odds tilted constantly against them. The cold deepened, predators struck, Neanderthals pushed back, and more than once our kind might have vanished into the snow. Just another branch of humanity, broken by the weight of time. And yet, they clung on not because they were destined to, but because in the face of terror they adapted. And as we dig deeper into their story, we begin to see that their survival was not a straight path, but a fragile dance on the edge of annihilation, one that will only grow more unsettling as we uncover what happened next. That fragile dance became even more perilous as the centuries unfolded, for the landscape of Europe was not static but alive, shifting like a beast with moods of ice and fire, with glaciers advancing like walls of white stone, and then retreating to reveal valleys reshaped beyond recognition, rivers redirected, forests crushed beneath the weight of ice, and herds driven into new corridors that could mean life or starvation, depending on whether our ancestors anticipated their movements or stumbled too late. And while Neanderthals had learned these rhythms over countless generations, modern humans were newcomers forced to master them at breakneck speed. For one misstep meant death, not just for an individual but for entire bands who depended on each member's survival. Archaeological traces whisper of those desperate adaptations, blades reworked again and again as prey changed, spear points designed with new precision, pigments gathered from the earth and smeared onto cave walls, not merely as decoration, but perhaps as invocations to unseen powers, and ornaments carved from ivory and bone, suggesting that even in hunger and fear, our species reached for symbols for meaning, as though the fight for survival was not only against predators and cold, but against despair itself. Yet the dangers pressing in were relentless. Lions prowled the cave mouths, waiting for any lapse in vigilance, while hyenas gathered in packs that could strip a carcass in minutes, and even the skies offered no mercy, for raptors with wingspans wider than a man's reach circled overhead. Capable of seizing the young before their mothers' screams could echo across the plain, forcing a vigilance that never ended. Every hour of every day a test of endurance. Within this crucible, encounters with Neanderthals grew layered and complicated, sometimes marked by violence over hunting grounds, sometimes softened by fleeting exchanges of tools or gestures, and sometimes blurring entirely as their blood flowed into ours, their DNA entwining with ours so deeply that even today, tens of thousands of years later, we carry fragments of their resilience in our bodies. Genes that sharpened our immune systems, shaped our skin and hair, even helped us withstand the merciless cold, revealing that survival was not just a contest of elimination, but also a merging, a strange, paradoxical union of rivalry and kinship that left permanent marks invisible to the eye, but enduring in the essence of who we are. Still, harmony was rare and competition fierce, for both species pursued the same herds of reindeer, sought the same shelters from wind and frost, and carved their lives out of the same unforgiving terrain. And as winters deepened, the stakes sharpened like flint edges, scarcity turning even kin into rivals, hunger gnawing away at compassion until survival demanded choices too dark to name. Archaeological sites bear silent testimony to this unforgiving reality. Caves where fires once burned now littered with abandoned tools, hearths gone cold, bones cracked open for marrow and then left for predators to gnaw, entire groups erased as though they had never been. And yet alongside those absences, traces of persistence. Other bands who pressed deeper into the continent, threading pathways through frozen valleys, expanding slowly, step by desperate step, until Neanderthals, once masters of this vast and brutal domain, began to thin, their presence receding like shadows before the rising light. Why they declined remains a mystery entwined with our arrival. Perhaps shifts in climate frayed their grip on the land. Perhaps invisible diseases carried by our kind ravaged their numbers. Perhaps relentless competition drained their strength. But the truth may also be darker, for survival rarely leaves room for mercy. And in a land where one group's fire meant another's cold, clashes over caves or prey may have ended, not in stalemates but in blood. One lineage left standing, the other vanishing into silence. Yet even as such shadows lengthened, our ancestors clung to something intangible but powerful. The ability to look beyond the moment, to imagine futures that did not yet exist, to thread meaning through chaos with stories spoken by firelight, turning fear into ritual, loss into memory, hunger into myth, and in doing so they built bonds that outlasted the ice and the hunger, bonds no predator could sever and no storm could scatter. Traces of ochre on walls are more than smudges. They are echoes of thought itself, of minds that refused to let the present swallow them whole, that reached for continuity and belonging when the world offered nothing but cruelty. And perhaps it was this weaving of symbols, this shaping of imagination, that tipped the scales of survival in our favor. Still, the path forward was never simple or secure, and as we look deeper, the unsettling truth emerges. Each step of our expansion came at terrible cost, with landscapes scarred by struggle, rivals extinguished, and an ever-present question hanging in the cold air, whether survival would prove enough to sustain us, or whether the very fire that carried us through the darkness would consume us in ways we could not yet foresee. The path forward was steep, yet from those frozen valleys and perilous encounters, a future began to take shape. For as Neanderthals dwindled and the land slowly bent to the will of new arrivals, modern humans carried with them more than fire and weapons. They carried the seeds of culture that would outlast the ice and echo into our own time, shaping what it means to be human. Cave walls in France and Spain preserve their visions. Animals painted in sweeping lines of ochre and black, not crude marks of survival, but expressions of awe and memory. Proof that even amid hunger and cold our ancestors lifted their eyes from the struggle and tried to capture meaning, perhaps to call upon spirits of the hunt, perhaps simply to remind themselves that they were part of something larger than death. These moments of creation were as vital as their spears, for they gave a band identity, unity and resilience when the environment stripped everything else away. Yet behind this flowering of imagination lay the darker truth that survival was written in conquest. Neanderthals, once dominant across Europe, vanished from the record within a few millennia of our arrival, leaving only traces in our blood. And whether their disappearance came through climate, chance or deliberate conflict, the result was the same. Our species stood alone, heirs to a continent once shared. That loneliness carried its own weight, for though we triumphed, the ghosts of those we replaced linger still, their DNA whispering through ours, reminders that history is not the story of one chosen victor, but a tapestry of vanished possibilities. The climate itself continued its ruthless cycles, forcing migrations, famines, and constant adaptation, but through persistence, ingenuity, and the power of shared imagination, modern humans endured, and by enduring they began to reshape the very story of life on Earth. From the fragile fires in Ice Age caves grew the first glimmers of myth, art, and ritual. The earliest threads of civilization woven in a world where extinction was always just one mistake away. And this is the unsettling truth. The first modern humans in Europe did not march inevitably toward victory. They stumbled, starved, bled, and nearly failed, walking a knife's edge between survival and annihilation. And only by chance combined with ingenuity did they carve a foothold in that hostile land. We live today not because their survival was certain, but because countless small, desperate decisions, where to move, whom to trust, when to risk, added up to just enough endurance to tip the balance. Every breath we take carries the weight of those ancient winters. Every face holds traces of their struggles and their mingling with those who came before. And their story is not one of inevitable triumph, but of terrifying fragility. And as we stand now, surrounded by technology and comfort, it is worth asking what their story reveals about ours. If survival then required imagination and unity, perhaps survival now demands the same, for the world remains as merciless as ever. Its challenge is different, but no less daunting. The legacy of Europe's first modern humans is not simply that we endured, but that we created meaning while enduring, and in doing so, we transformed terror into possibility. Their shadows flicker still in the firelight of our own lives, reminding us that every moment is borrowed from those who nearly fell, and that to understand what happened to them is to recognize the precarious miracle of our own existence. If you found yourself drawn into their struggle, if you feel the weight of their story lingering in your thoughts, then let it be a spark. Share this journey, subscribe for more, and continue exploring with us the mysteries of the past, for the deeper we look, the more astonishing and unsettling the truth becomes.